Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fourth and last live session of the first International Electronic Conference on Agronomy. This conference has been organized by MDPI and the Agronomy Journal, and I wanted to take this opportunity to thank our chair and conference committee, Gianni, our session chair for today, and all the participants for joining us. The conference is open for discussion, so remember that until May 17, you can still log in with your SafeForum accounts and read and comment all the submissions presented to the conference. Today, we will have a session dedicated to the challenges in grassland agroecology in a global change context, with a panel of 3 excellent speakers. The whole session will be chaired by our session chair, Dr. Gianni Bellocchi, from the French National Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment in France. We will have time for questions after each talk and maybe at the end. So please type your questions in the QA box that you will find at the bottom of your screen. I would also like to remind everyone that this live session is being recorded and that the recording will be posted in the conference webpage as soon as possible. Thank you for attending this session. I'm letting now Gianni to take over the webinar. Everyone, enjoy.
Good morning. Welcome to those who are joining the webinar on challenges in grassland agroecology in a global change context. My name is Gianni Bellocchi, and as already presented me, I am at the Grassland Ecosystem Research Unit of the French National Institute for Agricultural, Food and Environment in Clermont, Central France. Let me just briefly introduce the topic of this webinar. By grassland ecology, we refer mainly to permanent grasslands, which are closely linked to livestock activity and constitute a source of inspiration to support the agro-ecological transition in a changing world, in particular for their rich biodiversity, not only plant, but also animal and microbial, which can become a lever to act against the current environmental and agricultural crisis. The importance of grasslands for livestock systems and agricultural qualities is underlined by figures relating to the large area of agricultural land they cover worldwide, the high number of people depending on them for their income and food security, the high levels of biomass production and biodiversity, as well as their high carbon sequestration potential and limited nitrogen losses. However, these systems are now under threat as grassland surfaces are progressively lost or degraded worldwide, as reported by international agencies, with important consequences on their biodiversity, sustainability, and continued provision of services to society. Several human-induced factors can contribute to this degradation, from overgrazing to the introduction invasive species, which alter key processes responsible for productivity, biodiversity, and soil health, and which negatively affect the stability of the systems and the overall services they provide to society. So, given the complexity of the problem, in order to help us move forward with the scientific research and the implementation of tangible solutions, we have invited 3 qualified people whom I would like to thank for their ability and effort, with whom we will try to outline the complexity of the agroecological processes, articulating different aspects related to grassland research and management. So the first speaker, Dr. Catherine Picon-Cochard, is my head at the Grassland Ecosystem Research Unit. She will talk about the hidden half of the grassland ecosystem, that is the below ground part, which is hidden to the eye, but plays a key role in the functioning of grasslands. Then Dr. Massimiliano Probo from the Swiss Institute Agroscope will illustrate the agroecological and the economic benefits of fodder trees, agroforestry being sustainable alternative to agricultural systems that are heavily reliant on external inputs. The third speaker, Professor Xian from the Northwest Institute for Eco-Environment and Resources of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Lanzhou, northwestern China, will illustrate the desertification drivers of the alpine grasslands in the Tibetan Plateau. This is a sensitive high mountain region due to its large reservoir of ice and snow, making it the third reservoir after the Arctic and the Antarctic, and whose stability has been impacted in recent decades with important socio-economic consequences in the regions. So our thanks go to Professor Xiu, who struggles with a time zone that is not optimal for her. So my role ends here, and without taking any more time, I would leave immediately the floor to Dr. Picon-Cochard. So, Catherine, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. So, the title is The Hidden Half of Grassland Ecosystem in the Context of Global Change. So, I will talk about the roots and the root system in grassland ecosystem. So, as said by Gianni, I'm a researcher at the National Institute of INRAE. So it's a new name. It's INRAE with the E, it's environment. So working in Clermont. And thank you for the organization to give me this opportunity. So why roots are so important for plants and ecosystem sustainability? Because they supply a lot of services like anchorage for plants. They contribute to limit soil erosion and also contribute to the soil organic matter formation with the help of microbes. They contribute indirectly to soil fertility through exudation, through the high quality inputs of the tissue of the roots and for the microbes needs. And also, thanks to the roots, the plants can uptake elements, essential elements for their life, the water and the nutrients. But nevertheless, roots are understudied compared to leaves. So this is to give you an idea of the importance of soil carbon stocks for grasslands and especially for temperate grasslands. So this is an old source from IPCC, but anyway, it's still it's still true. So in grasslands, most of the carbon is in the soil, not in the above ground parts, compared to the forest. And why we have this high level of carbon stock in grassland soil? This is because of the contribution of roots to the incorporation of organic matter into the soil. Of course, depending on the management, above ground litter can also contribute to this input. But in general, for well-managed grassland, we consider that more than 95% of the litter is coming from the roots. So this is a complex activity, this degradation of the roots and all of the steps of the organic matter decomposition, thanks to the microbes and all organisms present into the soil. So when the roots entered into the soil with the dead roots, so the dead tissue of the roots, so we consider that the texture of the soil of this organic matter is coarse and young. And then during this complex continuum of degradation, at the end, when the organic matter is stable and very fine, the organic matter is very old. And on this graph, we can see that what I said, it's here you have coarse organic matter, and then during this whole the continuum of degradation, at the end we have very fine particles in the the soils. And the root tissue are embedded in the different mineral particles. So it's a very complex processes, this degradation. And yes, we consider that at the end, we find only 3 to 5% of root tissue in the very stable organic matter. But anyway, with no roots, we have no organic matter formation. So I will focus my talk about the roots, not on the degradation. So in grasslands, there is a high structure function diversity of this root system. Here there is a picture showing that. Of course, most of the, compared to forest, most of the root mass is localized on the upper part of the soil. But we have plants with very fine roots, like here or for grasses. And we can have for dicots, we can find some tap roots and bigger roots. So we have a very different root system in grasslands, and these roots are closely intermingled because the roots of the different species can be mixed, and it's not really separated like on this graph. So as I told you, the root system contributes to some ecosystem services like productivity, carbon storage, limitation of erosion, fertility, water cycle. And we are very interested, a lot of people, scientist people, are interested to understand how the functional traits of the roots are related to ecosystem services, because it's not so straightforward to study roots and then analyze the ecosystem services. So functional traits, it's a way, it's a kind of proxy of the function. So we are interested to do this relation. So I put here a table published with Barget and collaborators, and showing this kind of what is the knowledge of the relationship between the ecosystem services like carbon cycling, nutrient cycling, structural stability, with different root traits linked to architecture, morphology, physiology, or biotic. So you have a lot of arrows, different colors, different questions in this table. So the upward arrows show that there is a positive relationship between the traits and carbon cycling. And when the arrows is horizontal, there is no effect. And when the arrows are downward, there is a negative effect. And when you have question, it means that we have no knowledge or not enough knowledge. And the different colors corresponds to the certainty of this relationship. So when it's dark, we have high certainty. When it's really light or not very colored, we have no information. So for the carbon cycling, we can say from this work that we have clear relationship between root traits and carbon cycling, but regarding nutrient cycling, it's less evident and less evident for structural stability. So the conclusion of this work that we need more knowledge or more study to have higher information about how the roots are related to ecosystem services. Here I mentioned a work published by McCormack linking root types and root functioning, so the root structure function. And they have made this work with not with herbaceous species like on the left of this slide, but with trees. But I put some some picture of some herbaceous species just to show you that they have different root system. But for the McCormack, they consider different types of fruits related to the diameter. And of course, it is related to the position of the roots within the root system. So first order, it is a fine roots, finest fruits, and then up to 5 orders of fruits within the root system of trees. And they showed that depending on the root order, but this root order shows different function and different values of function, means that the finest fruit had higher absorptive capacity and lower transport capacity than the coarse one, with higher respiration, also higher nitrogen concentration. So it's when we study root traits, most of the people are working with the average root traits. So it's just to point that it's not so evident to understand well the results if you don't consider the root types within the root system. And here, this is an example that I made several years ago on 13 grass species. So it was a field experiment, but with monoculture. And we have compared root traits of this grass species. And we have analyzed the average root traits. So this is the red bar. So I show you the one trait. This is the root tissue density that is more or less related to the duration of the root and also to the quality of the root. So we have compared the average traits of root tissue density by considering all root types. So this is the red bar, and you have the 13 species on the x-axis. And compare this average root traits with the root traits of the finest root. So what this is in black, and for the coarsest root in green. So as expected, the coarse roots had higher tissue density than the finest roots for most of the species. But for some species like tall fescue here and ryegrass here, we have similar root tissue density between the finest and the coarsest. So it's just here to say that we observed a large intra-specific root trait variation, and it's not always the same conclusion between the fine and the coarse roots. So it's to say that if you don't consider the different root types when you analyze only the average root traits, you can make a lot of false results. So you have to be careful about this. Now I will focus my talk on the grazing effect on the roots, because of course you know that grasslands are managed. And grazing is one way to manage the grasslands and the perennial grasslands. Based on this meta-analysis given by made by Zhu and collaborators, they consider different grazing intensity and their effect, potential effect on carbon, different compartments of the ecosystem, and separating carbon and nitrogen for standing biomass, litter, roots, soil, and microbes. And what they observed that in general, so it's, well, sorry, it's a bit, maybe it's too small, but just to show you that for carbon response to grazing intensity, usually we have less carbon standing biomass, less litter, less roots, less soil, and less microbes when there is a grazing compared to no grazing. And for nitrogen, it's a bit different. So grazing intensity is expected to have a negative effect on root compartments. So we have made an experiment to assess how grazing affects root mass dynamics. So we use a long-term field experiment on an upland area. We work with a fertile grasslands, and it's a long-term observatory experiment. So after we did this experiment after 15 years of applying the same management, the same grazing management. So we compared abandonment, a first cattle treatment, we have 6.9 livestock units, and a second cattle treatment with 13.8 livestock units. So we have a gradient of intensity of utilization of the grassland by the cattle. And we expect higher root production in a lower intensity of utilization of the grasslands. And we made a 2-year study. So we use the INRAE score method to assess the root growth within the different treatments. So what is the INRAE score? So we dig a hole in the soil, then fill with a net, and we fill the net with soil without roots, and we let it during 1 or 2 months, depending on the period, the period of the year, and then collect again the mesh and put another mesh with soil without root, and then again. And then we collected such INRAE score, and then wash the root and measure the root mass. And we also measure the above ground mass with exclusion cage. What we observed an important role of climatic condition variability. This is the main result, but just before I can show you the results. So we have the 3 treatments, and for the first and the second year, we observe clear seasonal root production that is usually observed in grasslands, and it corresponds also to the seasonal above ground production of the grasslands. So what we observed in this experiment, that we observe a delay of root growth in the abandonment compared to the 2 cattle treatments for the first spring and summer period here, and also higher root production for the abandonment, but in October. And the second year, the same delay, but with no clear response for the autumn. So we have a phenology delay for the abandonment. We clearly observed at the above ground part. And we observed also an important drought effect for the second year. I don't show you the soil temperature and soil water content, but soil temperature was different across the treatment, and a clear effect between the cattle treatment and the abandonment treatment. And there was no effect of the treatment on soil water content. When we pull off, when we sum of the root production and the above ground production, we can calculate the below ground net primary production, and we observe this response. So the first year, we observe no differences across the different treatments, but it was different for the above ground. For the above ground, we have higher above ground biomass production for the 2 cattle compared to the abandonment. And the second year, for both below ground and above ground, we observe the decline due to the drought and an effect of treatment. The abandonment showed lower below ground net primary production compared to the cattle. So we we did not observe this decline of cattle treatment of the root production in the cattle treatment compared to the above ground, if we consider the results of the meta-analysis. So, well, it's our results were really affected by the climate variability. Now, I would like to focus my talk on the climate change effect on roots. So what is known about elevated CO2 warming effect and combined effect about elevated CO2 and warming effect on plants and ecosystem? So this is based on I showed the result based on the review where they analyze a lot of work. So this is number here. The numbers here are related to the papers. So here we have the carbon pools, the carbon losses, and the nitrogen into the soil. And when you have values here on the right, it means that you have an increase of these variables in response to elevated CO2. And when the values are on the left, it means that you have a decrease of the effect. And this is the same for warming and the combined CO2 with warming. So in general, we have a positive effect of elevated CO2 on the carbon pools of the ecosystem. It's less clear for soil carbon, and a decline of inorganic soil. So it's generally observed that elevated CO2 decline the nitrogen availability into the soil and also into the plants. And for the warming also shows an increase of the carbon pools. And for the soil, it's less clear, and we have more variability for inorganic nitrogen, but still a positive response to the warming. And when combined both, what we can observe that we have less studies, so, and we have higher variability. So it's less predictable if you only study the elevated CO2 and warming effect alone, it's not possible to predict the combined effect. And on this graph, it's just to show you that the direct effect of drivers of climate change on ecosystem are important, but also there are indirect effects and feedback on the ecosystem at the different compartments, the soil, the vegetation, but also on the atmospheric compartments. So if the ecosystem is really affected by the climate change, we can have an acceleration of the warming due to this feedback on the production of greenhouse gas by the ecosystem. So regarding elevated CO2 and warming, and if we are interested to know how the roots respond, it's important to know how these drivers affect the soil water content, because soil water content is really important for plant growth and ecosystem growth. And I show you two examples. The first one is results done in Australia. They compare different treatments, ambient CO2 with no warming, ambient CO2 with warming in red, elevated CO2 with no warming in blue, and elevated CO2 and warming in purple. And what is really clear that we have the warming here with no CO2 in red, that whatever the years and whatever the months, you have less soil water content. When you only increase the atmospheric CO2 in blue, this is the opposite. Here you have always higher soil water content. So there is a known effect of elevated CO2 to reduce stomatal conductance and possibly plant transpiration that explain why we can have higher saltwater content in these conditions. And when you combine both in purple, it's in the middle. So elevated CO2 have an important effect on the water economy on the plants. We did an experiment here in Clermont, and that show similar results, but it's not the same experiment. But comparing, for example, the control with the warming, the control in black and the warming in red. So the red in general has lower saltwater content than the control. So I will show you an example of the root response of this experiment that we set up. So we simulate warming by altitudinal gradients. So we have collected monoliths of grasslands in an upland area. We put some of these monoliths in the control, and the other monoliths were set up in the plain. So with the altitudinal gradient, we've got this 3.5 degree. We also simulate summer precipitation with the warming effect. And we also simulate a scenario for the end of the century, combining warming, summer precipitation, and higher CO2 concentration. So we follow the dynamics of the roots, the growth and the mortality with another technique, which is the mini rhizotron, that can give us an idea of the root demography. I mean, the growth and the mortality. And the hypothesis for this work was that with warming, we expected higher growth and higher also mortality, but still a net root production. With the summer precipitation reduction, we expected lower growth, but there are uncertainty for mortality and production. With elevated CO2, we expected also higher growth, but for mortality and production, we have no results to give a certainty of the conclusion. And for the scenario, it was really not clear what kind of results we can have. And I show you only the total root length after 3 years of this experiment for the different treatments. So the control on the left, the warming. What I didn't tell you that is for the warming, we supplied the same precipitation than the control to avoid this effect, but still we add lower saltwater content because of higher evapotranspiration in these conditions. Here we have the summer precipitation reduction and the total scenario. And what we observe, that we observe an increase of the root length for the live root, the root length due to warming, and the summer drought has no effect on this. And when increasing CO2, we observe a small increase compared to the other two warming treatments, and a clear increase compared to the control. For the dead roots, we have no effect. And the net production, which is the difference between live and dead roots, we still observe an increase of root length due to warming that is maintained under elevated CO2. I would like to show you a rapid example of what we are doing with extreme drought, because extreme drought are more and more frequent. This is a kind of...
Sorry, Catherine, we
yes,
should...
I have to go.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to show you that we did some experiment on some species, but in more controlled conditions. And what we try to see that we follow the root survivals with vital coloration. And we have shown that the presence of fructans into the roots can help them, increase the stability of the membrane. So the roots have tissue mortality, especially the cortex, but the steel is can survive, so it maintains the hydraulic function. So my conclusion. So to conclude, roots are important for plants and ecosystem because of they can deliver a lot of ecosystem services, contribute to the delivery of these ecosystem services. Management and climate variability affect root system, but more studies are necessary to know what are the best grazing and mowing practices to reduce grassland vulnerability facing more frequent and intense climatic changes such as drought and heat wave, and also to maintain soil carbon stock and forage production, and also to understand how species diversity change induced by management affect grassland's resilience to extreme events like droughts. And due to the complexity of below ground compartment, collaborative work should be done between ecologists, agronomists, and soil scientists. First, to homogenize protocols and methods, and also long-term field experiments are really crucial to understand what happens to the grassland ecosystem. And also, my last point, researchers must contribute to understand how in the long term, grassland can be still the best option for cattle, milk, and cheese production. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. This is really very interesting. We have time for one or two questions. We already have a question from Muhammad Tayyab. Has left the question on the chat. Okay, why do different crop varieties cultivars contain varying organic matter, soil pH, moisture content in the rhizosphere? So he would like to know what are the reasons for that. Not easy.
Yes. What is known is the quality of the roots in general differs across species. So variety, why not? And also this quality shapes the microbes, the diversity. So there are why it's due to the metabolism of each plant. So for some plants, there are more tannins, there are more sugars. So and also it is depending on the phenology of the plants. So it's due to the physiology of each variety and each species, and depending also on the state and the phenology of these species. So I think the type of molecules, they are common. There are some commons across plants, but they are more or less present, and depending on the physiology of these plants. And then there are some results showing that this quality shape the diversity of the microbes. Diversity, yes, and activity of the microbes. I hope to have well answered.
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. So, don't know if there are other questions. There is a voice thanking Catherine, really very interesting. Okay, so I would suggest to move straight on Massimiliano's presentation, and probably we'll have some time at the end to wrap up the different questions. So please, Massimiliano.
So thank you, Gianni, and the organizer for inviting me today to this webinar. When firstly Gianni asked me to present something about agroecology and grassland and climate change, my first thought was to talk about agroforestry. Even if it's quite a new topic, also for us, we are just starting to work on this topic, but I think that has several links to agroecology and can also provide some benefits to grassland in general, and also can also be probably a valuable option in terms of adaptation to climate change. So the topics of this short talk will be to give a quick overview about the agroecological and economic benefits of fodder trees, to speak a bit about different options in terms of management, and then to provide some values about the nutritional quality of different species. And then I will also show a trial that the University of Turin, where I worked for several years, made to analyze the effect produced on the chemical composition of milk, and then just a few general conclusion and perspective for the future. So talking about the agroecological and economical benefits of fodder trees, we can say that trees have many ecosystem function, and they can provide many ecosystem services. And for example, looking to the soil, we can see that they can play a role in the reduction of the erosion. They have also this capacity to access into the deeper soil other nutrients, so they can be in a certain way complementary to the grassland. But of course, they can also play a role to regulate the wind, which can have an important role in the evapotranspiration, so in the plant development, but also a role in the consumption of energy by the livestock. So because livestock need to maintain their body temperature. And so, for example, in England, they made a comparison in which they compared an open grassland system with an edge-based system in grassland, and they measured that there was a significant increase in milk production and also in livestock weight gain when there was present some trees that can also reduce this wind. And then, of course, the important role is also about the water cycle, because they can reduce water infiltration and also gulling. They can increase the soil organic matter, as we have also seen in the first presentation, which was about grassland. But of course, also trees can play this role by providing a lot of roots, fine roots, also leaves, and increase the soil organic matter into the soil. And then for particular families or species, there can be also a role about nitrogen fixation, for example, the legumes, but the alders too. But the trees can also be important to naturally dry out some wet soil, so creating more favorable condition to reduce the presence of bacteria and some illness for livestock. And of course, as we can see in the picture below, they can produce shade. And this is very important because they can reduce the impact of heat stress, which is more and more becoming important due to climate change. And there are some studies that have measured an average reduction in temperature of about -3, -6 degrees when there is this shade provided by the trees. And this, of course, has again an economic impact. And the US, they have measured that only the impact of heat stress every year is more than $1 billion. And of course, this shade has also an impact in the nearby grassland, because it can also reduce the impact of the drought in the grassland species. But of course, other important roles that can have the trees are about the conservation of biodiversity, because they can provide shelter and food for birds, for insects, for mammals, and also they can provide other type of products, not only leaves and forage, but of course wood, but also fruit and mushrooms. So talking about the different possibility of management, we can see that there are several ones. One which is very well known, is the use of polar trees. It means the trees are cut at a certain height to reduce the stem growth, so to reduce the height growth, the canopy extension of the trees. And so by this way, we can provide the leaves to the livestock, and these leaves can be eaten fresh, or also historically, this was very used until 1 century ago. They were dried and fed to livestock in winter. The same types of management, but done in a different way, can be with the prune trees, which are cut at the lateral part. So here we will cut only the lateral branches, and we will develop a different form of the trees. But the same principle is that we can use this kind of leaves for the direct consumption of the animals after the cut. Another different system can be instead the use of hedges, fodder hedges. As you can see here is a picture in South America of a plantation of wild mulberry. in which you can see that there is a high density of trees, and in which the trees are periodically cut or grazed. And so you can see that the height is really ideal for the direct consumption of the livestock. But of course, we can also have some copies. So we can cut the trees at the base and use the resprout that come from the stump. You can see that the biomass production can be quite important for certain species. But also, of course, in a silvopastoral system, we can have a direct consumption by the animals. Different livestock categories can reach different height and have a direct impact on the trees. And the last point I wanted to show is the use also of short rotation coppices, which are generally used for energy wood. So in this system, there is a high density of trees that we can have up to 15 or also 20,000 plants per hectare. The production of biomass is quite important, can reach up to 12 tons of dry matter per hectare per year. And also the height, for certain species such as willow, which are very fast growing, we can have 3 meters of height every year. And of course, there is in this system a big production of leaves that can be also used by the animals, but the system must be adapted, of course, in terms of the density to the direct grazing by the animals. And the different management option can, of course, have an impact in terms of the overall production. So if we just have high stem trees with an average density for about 200 trees per hectare, this is an example about white mulberry, which is a very interesting species, as I will show you later. We can reach an overall production of about 10 tons of dry matter per hectare per year, and the peak will be reached after about 20 years. But if we will have more, let's say, intensive management tree system, so with the higher density of trees, with the 20,000 trees per hectare, and with a more intensive cut, we can increase the biomass product per hectare up to 25,000 of dry matter per year. And also the peak of production will be reached before, so just after 6 years. So we really have to think which kind of system we want to have and to adapt the different option according also to the characteristic of the different species. So moving to the nutritional value, we can say that animals browse generally on leaves, on young and green and tender twigs, on flowers, on fruits. This is something that they naturally do. And if you have a look to the forage quality, and in particularly to the content of lignocellulose, we can see that it is not so different from those of grassland. Indeed, if we consider that generally the 75% or more 80-85% of the diet by grazing livestock on the trees is composed by leaves, the average lignocellulose content is about 36%. This is an example about oak leaves in summer, but other values are quite near to that from other species. And this value is quite comparable to the values that we can generally find in grassland. Here I put some values from a lowland grassland. The second cycle is about 30%, but if we have a look, for example, to a alfalfa hay, and the second cycle, it can reach 40%. Here I want to show you 2 or 3 tables from a work made by Novak and Al, that are colleagues in the INRAE in France, which have recently published a very nice paper in which they have analyzed a large set of species, and they have analyzed the protein content, the fiber content, the condensed tannin content, the digestibility of all these species. And here I wanted to point it out the interest for some particular species. The first one I wanted to talk about is white mulberry, that I already mentioned before. That's because this species is a species that is fast growing, has a certain resistance to drought, and has also very good qualities. For example, the average digestibility is more than 80%. In other paper, I also found values around 90%. So really high digestibility, a very good protein content, and also not so high fiber content. Another species that can have a certain interest is goat willow, Salix caprea, which has also good values in terms of digestibility, of protein content, and also the condensed tannin content is not so high. So the digestibility also remain at a good level. Another important species that was commonly and historically used is common ash, which has also an interesting utilization. For example, here on the Alps was historically given the leaves, also was also used, the leaves was dried, given in the winter, and is quite productive too. Another one, moving to more Mediterranean species, can be some alders, such as Alnus cordata, in which even if the digestibility is lower, this species can be really interesting because it is a nitrogen fixing species, and the average nitrogen content is about the protein content is about 17%. All these values are related to August, but of course, if we have a look to young leaves, it is also even higher. And then the last species I wanted to mention is also another Mediterranean species, which is the fig tree. And this species was and is historically used in the Mediterranean silvopastoral system. It is again a species with a very high digestibility and very good mineral content too. And then in another paper, the same authors have also analyzed the macro and the micro nutrient content. And here I put on the right side some comparison data coming from grassland forage, because here we can see that if you have a look to this nutritional value in the tree leaves, for example, the phosphorus content is very much comparable to the phosphorus content that we can generally find in grassland forage. And for other nutrients, we can also have higher value. This is the case of the calcium. And for other nutrients, the values remain quite comparable to those we can generally find in grassland. The last table I wanted to show you is from another paper that was published last year. In this paper, the authors have analyzed the in vitro fermentation production of different gases, and in particular of ammonia, of methane, and they compared this with the production of methane and ammonia, which is produced by perennial ryegrass. So all the values you can see in the last columns are the ratio between the production of these three species and the production which is made by perennial ryegrass, which is a very important and worldwide used grassland species. What you can see here, it is that in most of the cases, the production of ammonia, of methane, and of gases, and of these gases that has an impact on climate change, is lower compared to the grassland species. So this is another interesting point that we can keep in mind by considering that when livestock is fed with three species, we can also reduce the production of certain gas. Then there is also the interest to understand when we should use these tree forage. And in this paper that I have published with some colleagues from Italy last year, we have analyzed along the season, which was the protein content, and we have compared it with those of grass. And what we can see in this graph is that there is, at the end, a limited interest at the beginning of the season because the protein supply is already guaranteed by the grass. But in late summer, in the beginning of autumn, it is the opposite, because the fodder trees can maintain a good level of protein while the grass naturally decline. their protein content. So the main interest is above all in the second part of the season, and also because due to climate change, this part of the season is becoming more and more critical because of the severity of the drought period we are facing. So in summary, the more interesting fodder tree species are the white mulberry, the goat willow, the common ash, the alder, different species of alder, the fig tree. And what we saw that the nitrogen, the total nitrogen content of the best fodder trees was comparable to those of the typical forage grassland species. In terms of the total fiber content was often lower. The lignin was generally a bit higher, but overall the digestibility was comparable, or for certain species, as we saw for the mulberry, was better. Another point interesting is the content of condensed tannin. In that case, generally this content is higher than that of herbaceous species, but was in most of the cases below the critical threshold of 50 grams per kilo of dry matter. If we have a higher content than that, there can be some anti-nutritional effect for livestock, but this was not the case for the species that I mentioned before. And for the minerals, we saw that the phosphorus was comparable, the calcium was higher, the magnesium was, and also for the potassium, there was no risk of excess. And the sodium at the opposite was a bit lower than that of typical forage species. So we have to consider this and providing some supplementation, for example, if livestock is fed with a high percentage of these fodder species. And in general, for the gas production, the ammonia production was quite variable depending on the species, while the methane production was almost always lower than that of perennial ryegrass. And this is again related to the presence of these secondary compounds, the condensed tannins, that can disturb the fermentation in the rumen. And in that case, the proteins are more difficult to access and degrade. So coming to the last part of the presentation, I wanted to mention here an effect that can be present when livestock is fed with this kind of forage resource, and the effect on the milk chemical composition. In this trial performed in Piedmont in northern Italy, we analyzed the goats' diet and the effect on milk composition when goats were grazing into two different paddocks. In the first paddock, there was an open grassland layer, so an herbaceous layer with many grass species, while in the second paddock, the goats were grazing in a grazable forest land, which was rich in many shrub and fodder tree species such as birch, rowan, willow, bramble, and so on. In both the paddocks, the livestock was stocked at a comparable stocking rate. In the open grassland paddock, the goats were grazing in the late part of June, while in the grazable forest land, they were grazing in 1 month later, so in the late part of July. Concerning the management, so the goats were housed during the night, and then they were milked twice a day, in the morning, in the evening, and then during the whole day they were grazing within the paddocks. During the milking activities, we provided also a commercial concentrate a bit for the milk production. And so the specific objectives of the work were to assess the feeding preferences of goats, to examine the related effects on milk composition with a particular reference to the milk fatty acid. Why milk fatty acids? Because they are a very important parameter of the quality of the milk, and also because they are often related to some effects that are produced on the health of the consumer. And so in that paper, we specifically analyzed the vegetation, botanical composition, the selection operated by the goats. We analyzed the feed quality, the milk quality, and in this short presentation, I will just focus on the two latter points. So about the feed quality, what we measured in general is that there was a high nutritional quality for both the open grassland and the grazable forest land vegetation types. We went into the detail of the fatty acid, and here we measured significant differences between the two paddocks. So for the open grassland, there was a higher content of saturated fatty acid, or of monosaturated fatty acid, or of omega-6, while in the grazable forestland, where mainly the content of omega-3 fatty acids was significantly higher. So our question was, does this can have an effect also on the fatty acid profile of the milk, by considering that the concentrate was really comparable when goats were grazing in the different paddocks? We also had a look to the phenolic fractions, so of the forage coming from the open grassland and coming from the grazable forestland. And here again, we detected significant differences, in particular, a higher content of both total phenols and total tannins in the grazable forestland. And again, our question was, does this can have an impact on the fatty acid profile of the milk when goats are grazing into these different paddocks? In general, the values we found here are quite comparable to the average values that are commonly found in the Alps. So coming to the milk, here we can see that the production was different between the two different paddocks. There was a decrease in the milk production where the goats were in the grazable forestland, but this is also related to the lactation stage, because this was a month later, so the peak of lactation was already passed, and so there was a normal decrease of the production. At the opposite, we could also see that the fat, protein, and casein content were not significantly different among the two different paddocks, while the lactose was a bit lower when goats were in the grazable forestland. So coming to the fatty acid profile of the milk, we saw that, first of all, there was not a significant difference in the fatty acid fatty acids that have a branched chain. And this is a good sign, because this is related also to the impact of the phenols. So this means that even if the phenol content was higher in the grazable forestland, the impacts on this particular group of fatty acid was not significant. At the opposite, what we saw was that many of the fatty acids that are generally associated with health promoting properties for human were significantly higher where goats were grazing on the trees and on the shrubs. And this was the case in particular for the conjugated linoleic acid, for the polyunsaturated, for the omega-3 fatty acid. So in conclusion, we can say that the ruminal microbial activities was not inhibited by the higher amount of phenolic compounds contained in the ingesting plants in the forest. We can also say that the fatty acid profile of the ingested plant species affected the fatty acid milk composition of the milk, and that the forage shrubs and trees had a positive effect on the fatty acid composition of the milk, with a higher presence of health-promoting fatty acids such as omega-3, total CLA, and vasenic acid. These are well known to have a positive effect for the human, in particular for the brain development, for the reduction of blood cholesterol concentration, and also for the reduction of cancer and diabetes. So coming to the conclusion and the perspective, I can say that fodder trees can provide fodder as a part of the animal diet. They can maintain a good quality throughout the season, and especially in late summer, when there are these increasing impacts of drought. They can be a forage production option in a changing climate, as they are also more resistant to a drought period because of this deeper root system. They can also allow a diversification of the animal products. Here I show an example about milk, but in literature you can find other examples about this effect also for cheese and for meat. And so in terms of nutraceutical components, but also of taste, of texture and safety. Here in the bottom right, you can see also an image of some producers that are starting to differentiate also their cheese products when the animals are fed in this particular with this particular tree fodder resources. And then to conclude, we can also say that they can diversify the grazing system, they can increase the resistance, the resilience, and the biodiversity, and they can also reduce the grazing intensity in the grassland areas. So with that, I am done. I thank you for your attention, and I am available if there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Massimiliano. You made a big work of a synthesis of the studies which are ongoing on agroforestry. We discovered a lot of things, including this nice experimentation you made in Piedmont. So there are interesting pathways which are emerging on the applicability of agroforestry in different contexts. So Sarah made a question, but finally she already had the answer on the way. So there are no other questions in the discussion. So I will make a question. You see that apparently multiple options are possible in applying agroforestry. What do you feel about the most feasible, not only technically, but also economically, what can become really applicable to concrete situations as a tangible solutions to favor the agroecological transition?
Yeah, I think that a good option can be really provided by these fodder hedgerows, because they can reduce, of course, all the operations which are quite time consuming, which can be expensive. For example, the operation about the use of polar trees, because in polar trees you really have to manually cut a lot of branches to provide them to the animals, so it's a lot of work for the farmers. And as we have less and less farmers in Europe, we also have to think about the sustainability of the process. So I think that the forage hedgerows in which the trees are periodically cutted every year, you can also mechanize this process, can be more sustainable. So you can have a yearly production of the forage, but you can also have a mechanization. And also you can have with these small trees a direct consumption of the animals. So this can also be really a more sustainable way to introduce an agroforestry system into the grassland. And for example, if I have still 1 minute, was just to show you very quickly a project we are now writing, and we will start working on agroforestry next year, in which we have foreseen to plant different forage hedgerows. We made a selection of the most interesting trees, and in this system you can see that we have foreseen some space for the tractor to pass, to cut, to make the hay. And here we can also mechanize the cutting of the trees along the line. And this can be done every year. Of course, for the 2-3 first year, you have to wait. And so you have to wait that the trees are developed, and then you can start cutting them. In the selection, we have also considered some tree species that have the capacity to resist to a certain cutting frequency. But in this way, I think we will have a sustainable way to produce forage every year, and having also parts of these agroecological and economical benefits which are provided by the trees. Okay. I don't know if there are other questions. Yeah, I'm reading now. Do you think fodder trees can play a role in meat production with cows in the northern European area? Yes, of course. I think also that in northern countries there is an increasing interest in agroforestry. In particular, there are some works in England that I've read. I think that as the impact of climate change is now everywhere, and also in areas that were not historically so impacted by drought period, they are facing this kind of problem. I think that this can be a solution also in the northern countries. Even if this kind of system was more and more historically adopted in Mediterranean countries, in Southern Europe, in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Greece. But now we see that there is a growing interest, of course, also in Central Europe and also in Northern Europe. Of course, the species of the trees are different, but there are examples with the use of elm, with the use of ash, with the use of willow in this in England. So I think, yeah, in the future they play an increasing role also in Northern country.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Questions. We'll move on to the third speaker. So Professor Xian from Chinese Academy of Science. Please, Xian, the floor is yours.
I want to thank Gianni for giving me this opportunity and to share my research today. My topic is the desertification of alpine grassland on the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. I will show it from these factors. First of all, it's the overview of the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. The plateau has a total area of 2.6 million square kilometer and 2.5 million square kilometer in China. The average height is over 4,000 meters above sea level. Therefore, it's known as the third pole. The permafrost area in the plateau is about 1.5 million square kilometers, which is the largest permafrost distribution area in the low latitudes of the world. The active layer covering the permafrost contains approximately 12.3 pg of the soil carbon. Any small change in the active layer will change the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and further affect global climate change. The plateau has about 1.42 million square kilometers of alpine grassland. As the largest alpine pasture globally, the alpine grassland supports 1.6 million herders, 85% of whom are Tibetan people. The desertification of alpine grassland directly affects the people's survival in the plateau. Next, let us see the characteristics of alpine grassland. In the plateau, there are mainly three types of alpine grassland in the plateau. From southeast to northwest, there are alpine meadows, alpine steppes, and alpine desert steppe. The plateau is controlled by precipitation, and the A, B, C, D, E, F in these figures, and so the climate zones. A means humid areas, and B is a moist subhumid area. C means dry subhumid area. D means semi-arid area, and E arid area, and F hyper-arid areas. And the plants in the alpine meadows are mainly Cobrisa species. The kind of species is low than 10 centimeters. However, the coverage is high and about over 85%. The roots are short but dense and flexible, and form the mat layer, which can resist erosion and grazing. Therefore, the alpine meadow is the best pasture in the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. The plants in the alpine steppe are mainly sleeper species. These kind of species are higher than a Cobrisa species, but it has a relatively lower coverage. It's about the average coverage is about 16%. Their root is longer but less dense and cannot resist erosion and animal trample. is also the better pasture in the plateau. The primary plants in the desert steppe are semi-shrubs or small shrubs with poor coverage. The wind erosion is strong, and the earth's surface is covered by sand and gravel. But it's the natural landscape controlled by climate in a geological period, very long time. It's not a rapid change in a short time. In recent decades, land degradation has become severe in the alpine grassland of the Qinghai-Tibetan Plateau, especially in the alpine meadow. There are three main kinds of degradation. There are frozen ground degradation, grassland degradation, and eolene desertification. The frozen ground degradation is characterized as collapse or landslides on the sunny in the sunny slopes and top of the hills. In the flat place, the polygonal cracks are well spread. The manifestation of grassland degradation is not only the decrease in the coverage and heat of plants, but also is the increase of unpalatable and poisonous weeds. According to our research, over half of alpine meadow encounters the invasion of poisonous and unpalatable weed species, even though the coverage keep unchanged or increased. The plants in three pictures of the bottoms are all unpalatable and poisonous weeds, even though they have a higher coverage. And there are three kinds of eolene desertification types. There are sandy and gravel surface resulting from the erosion in the grassland. And the third is the dune activity near the, mainly near the rivers and lakes. What's the relation between the three kinds of the degradation and desertification? Let us review the conception of the desertification of UNCCD. Firstly, we know desertification means land degradation. Secondly, land degradation means the loss of vegetation, soil, and land productivity. And the early period of poisonous species invasion, the heat and coverage might increase, but the pasture productivity decreased because it can't support the animals. Therefore, we still define it as desertification. So we think grassland degradation, frozen ground degradation, and eolene desertification are all desertification in the plateau. What's the relationship between the three kinds of desertification? According to our research, we think they are a relationship sequentially in many places. For example, the vegetation coverage will decrease with the frozen ground degradation and grassland deterioration. After vegetation lost, the water and wind erosion increased. The surface becomes sandy, and with the intensified erosion and the sandy particles are eroded away, the surface becomes gravel. So it's the close relation and in the temporal sequential. But some places, the vegetation is lost directly without the deterioration process. In some places, in the fixed dunes. The pantone is also called eolene desertification. In this situation, the three kinds of degradation are independent. The frozen ground degradation and grassland deterioration must not appear. The situation is not very common and only distribute someplace near the rivers and lakes. If the relationship among these three kinds of degradation is close. They should share the distribution area in the plateau. However, the current research doesn't support this. These three figures show the distribution of ground degradation, the area with red line, and the distribution of frozen ground degradation and eolene desertification. From these three figures, we can see that they are inconsistent. We figure out some reasons for the inconsistent. In some places, frozen ground degradation in the early stages and the change in vegetation coverage is not apparent. In some places, vegetation deterioration has occurred due to the invasion of unpalatable species, but the coverage keeps unchanged and even increased. The two pantones are not monitored by remote sensor technique, but we know that's the main method now to monitoring the vegetation coverage. The third reason is that many scholars confuse the natural desert and the desert steppe in the arid area and with the desertification. So, according to our understanding, desertification comprising the three kinds of degradation should distribute this area. It's the junction between semi-arid and sub-arid areas, between permafrost and seasonally frozen ground, between alpine meadow and alpine steppe. The zone is fragile and unstable and is very sensitive to climate change and human activities. So it's why it distributes these regions. We summarize some factors to identify the grades of desertification in the plateau. They include not only coverage, heat, biomass, but plant species, landforms, soil, trees, rodents, small mammals, and so on. Of course, it's also essential to distinguish between natural deserts and desertification. Based on our understanding, we propose the three kinds of processes of desertification. Process one is triggered by grassland deterioration. It's from unpalatable and poisonous plants species increase to plant coverage decrease and wind and water erosion increase, then finally desertification. The process two is triggered by frozen ground degradation. Firstly, from frozen ground degradation, then vegetation lost, wind and water erosion increased, then desertification. The third process three is fixed dunes activation, and the vegetation is lost on fixed dunes. Then dunes activation, then desertification. This figure shows the different development states of the three kinds of degradation and their relationship, from potential to slight to moderate, severe, and very severe. Finally, I like to discuss the cause and the driving mechanism of desertification. The two figures present the current opinion. It's from the Harris very famous papers. The figures present some cause of desertification in the plateau. They have a harsh environment and drought, warming, glacier retreat, permafrost degradation, small mammals, rodent, land use, overgrazing, privatization, and sedentarism. But personally, I cannot entirely agree with most of this list. Why? And because based on my research in the plateau, I prefer climate warming and overgrazing as a primary cause of desertification, and they will cause vicious circles and of desertification. Among these, and the role of climate warming is more important. Based on our long-time warming control experiment in the plateau, and since 2010, and my group conducted a warming experiment in the hinterland of plateau with altitude about 4,600 meters above sea level, and so based on the results, we think climate warming is the main driving force for desertification. Firstly, warming induces the soil of frozen water in the active layer. I just mentioned the active layer carried the permafrost. Its heat in plateau is about 250 centimeters. And contain many water, frozen water, and the warming can release this frozen water from the released soil water in the root zone is lost due to evaporation and infiltration. Then the soil in the root zone become drying, and this figure shows a result. This figure shows the soil moisture profile in the control and the warming plots in the whole year. The left panel is a whole year, and the right panel is a growing season from June to September, and 2011 to 2012. We can see that soil moisture decreased in the root zone, these steps. And because of the warming treatments, warming is this. The drought is. We also can see that this is a warming soil moisture in the warming plots. So the drought is stronger in the growing season. The right figure shows the soil moisture profile of control. C means control, and warming plots in the different months of the growing season. The bottom panel is a warming treatment. We can see soil moisture in the shallow layer, the root zone, and the soil moisture decreased due to warming treatments. But the soil moisture at the deep layer increased due to the increased infiltration of soil moisture from released from the frozen water in the active layer. The drying soil in the shallow layer, root zone, and can change the composition of the plant's community. Coryza species, I just mentioned, they have a very short and dense roots. They cannot get enough water in the shallow layer if the soil moisture decreased and decreased but the water increased in the deep layer. The Coryza species cannot get more water, so they gradually disappear and decrease. The poisonous and unpalatable weeds, they have deep roots, can get more water in the deep layer, therefore gradually replace the sites and the pasture grass like side species. And due to these kinds of plants, such as stepa or sometimes stepa, sometimes is unpalatable weeds, and they have no dense mat layer, and so cannot to protect the soil from the erosion. Therefore, the erosion from water and wind increased quickly. So we think that soil drought in the root zone promoting community succession is a key ecological process of alpine grassland desertification. The frequent erosion and decreased input of litter due to the decreased biomass and the coverage results in a decrease in soil organic matter and soil moisture, and increase in bark density. From 2014 to 2020, my group chose 36 sites in the hinterland of the plateau and to make observation. There are 5 grades of desertification plots for each site. We measured soil and vegetation traits in each plot and got the average values of soil traits. The 3 figures show the result. We can see with the intensity of desertification, soil moisture decreased and the organic decreased, but the bark density increased. Soil traits deterioration can weaken the water holding capacity. More soil water in the root zone is lost due to evaporation or infiltration. Infiltration increases soil moisture at the bottom of the active layer. More latent heat can be released to thaw the frozen water, and the soil temperature keeps increasing. Frozen ground degradation exacerbates with triggered new desertification, so the vicious cycle forms. The figures show the decreasing the water holding capacity with the desertification intensity. The other data also come from the 36 sites in the plateau. The middle figures is a picture of soil moisture infiltrate with the desertification intensity. We can see water infiltrate more easily in the severe desertification plots. The two figures are the experimental results in the warming and the desertification treatments. It can be seen that warming and the desertification combined accelerates the desertification. So that's my representation. Thank you for attention.
Excellent presentation. Thanks a lot. I think you could help us clarify many concepts about the desertification process and the driving mechanisms staying behind, especially in this very sensitive region, which is the Tibetan Plateau, about which probably the European audience is not fully aware of. So this last speech, extremely interesting to understand the cascade of processes which are triggered in the alpine grassland systems, which in turn determine or may provoke a change in the grassland composition. I think there is a matter for a nice exchange with the work also Catherine is doing with the root traits. As you have shown that there are changes in soil traits. There is a matter to go more into depth also with respect to change in root traits according to Catherine work. Then I had a question on the role of remote sensing. If I well got from your presentation, there are some limitations in the remote sensing to monitor the evolution and the spatial distribution and the desertification context. Could you please precise a bit more the role of remote sensing, the type of limitation, the kind of improvements that we can logically expect in the future?
So you means the grassland is Tibetan plateau is sensitive to the future climate change? Is your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, in the last before from 1980s to 2000, the temperature rise very high. But in recent years, and the air temperature increase not very large. So we just guess if the air temperature keep increased, and because in the Tibetan plateau, we know many permafrost and activate there, and if the warming keep, and they will disappear, and maybe the soil drought will strong, and the upper grassland meet some danger condition. But some scholars don't think this from two aspects. Firstly, they don't think the warming can keep higher and higher, because in recent 10 years, it's not very obvious warming. The second, some scholars think and the warming can provide the vegetation plants to grow, not degradation. But in my opinion, and maybe in a short time, and warming can provide the make the plants increase. But this result is from the remote sensor monitoring. It only monitors the coverage, but can't see the species change. Actually, based on our field observation and research, we think warming can cause the species degradation. In a long time, maybe it will be worse, but it's just our guess.
Yeah. Probably remote sensing should be complemented with the ground sensors, which would be more sensitive to change you were observing. This is also a question that I have for Massimiliano. Because I know that remote sensing is becoming even more important for agricultural monitoring. But in the case of agroforestry, when you have animals below plants, I guess that all these remote sensing products become very, very limiting. What do you think about?
Yeah, I mean, it depends from the system, because if you have high stem trees, of course, some of these feature you want to measure with remote sensing are hidden, so it's not possible. But with small trees which are managed with as forage hedgerows, I think that the canopy cover is limited compared to the high stem. So there are still some possibilities if you want to measure some parameters nearby the forage hedgerow. So it is anyway a good tools that you can apply also in this kind of system. But of course, with the canopy of the trees, some of the variables of the parameters can be more difficultly measured on the grassland. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I have a question to Catherine. She's seeing something interesting in the Xian's presentation for your own work.
An evident question. What is important is to
because you are stressing on the importance of root traits.
Yes.
Yes, all the modifications that is undergoing there, probably they have an impact on the root traits as well. And root traits may become an indicator probably on the full set of modifications that are occurring.
Yes, what is important is to know where are the resources for the plants and where are the roots regarding these resources. What I understood in the presentation of Xian is that some species were replaced, so some species with shallow roots were replaced by wheat with a deeper root system. maybe because the shallow soil is dry and the native plants cannot survive, and they were replaced by species able to colonize the soil in deeper horizons.
Yeah.
So yes, but yes, it's important. If the plants are not able to put their roots where there is water in the soil, they will die. That's the problem. And in the case of your system, it's very dry, and the conditions are not favorable to the plants that only grow in a shallow root, in the shallow soil, where it's too dry. So I don't know what to say more. Maybe, but I have a question about how is there some plans for restoration, and in case of is there some plans for restoration, and what kind of species and traits to choose for this the restoration of these grasslands. I hope that concerning the root depth can be an important trait to consider, but not only. Do you have some restoration plans of these ecosystems, and with which kind of traits do you choose to do this restoration? The question for you, Xian.
You mean this?
Yeah.
You mean this shrubs?
Ceratocarpus. Okay. Okay. Is this the Ceratocarpus, the reference shrub species for supporting restoration in these systems?
Sorry.
The plant that you have shown on your screen. So it was the Ceratocarpus.
So maybe it's not a restoration. This is the most adapted species for these conditions. Maybe it's not for but I assume that it's really difficult to do this kind of restoration due to the very high surface considered by the desertification. So, but what? It's really pessimistic for us, because if we expect this kind of land degradation for the future in the areas in the globe that are not in this state of degradation, it's really we have to think a lot, and to say how to avoid this desertification.
Actually, sorry.
Yes, please.
This kind of shrub only distribute in very arid and half-arid areas, and I don't know animals can eat this. But it is the most area of the Tibetan plateau, and the extensive pasture is upper meadows with the species Cobricas, and the sliba species in the alpine steppe also is a pasture, but now due to the soil become dry, and some poisonous with I don't know the names, some palatable and some palatable weeds with very broad leaves and high stems, and they can become primitives. The animals can't eat them, but they have a very long root systems.
Yes, and so there is. Do you know where? What is the soil depth? of these areas? What is the soil depth?
Soil depth.
You mean the soil depth?
Yes.
What soil depth? You mean this kind of? You mean the root?
You mentioned the deep roots, but how long are the roots? And
the root the depth, and for the Cobrisa species is only maybe 10. The average root average depth of root is 20 centimeters and less than 30 centimeters. But for these unpalatable weeds, they can reach over 50 centimeters, even 1 meters.
Okay. So the most palatable species have a shallow rooting system, while the least palatable can go deeper into the soil and become more resistant to arid conditions. Yeah. So, are your grazing animals yaks?
Yes. Yeah, yaks and sheep is the main animals in the plateau. The goats
as well,
but not very common. The yak and
you don't have cows.
What?
Cows.
Cows, yes. The cows, not too much cows. That's the yak.
Yak is the dominant animal species. Okay, so for all the three speakers, are there aspects that you couldn't deal with during your presentation you want to highlight? We still have some minutes, probably, if you want to precise some aspects that you could not deal with in sufficient detail, just do it now. So I met some pressure on Catherine to close her presentation. Probably you wanted to specify some things in a higher detail.
No. In fact, I was just finishing, so it's
not specifically.
Not specifically.
Massimiliano, I know you made a big effort to make this synthesis of different studies and to zip, to compact all these studies in 25 minutes. Do you want to highlight something else that you consider important, interesting?
No, maybe what I can just add is that here I think there is also a social aspect in about talking about agroforestry that is also interesting. What we are seeing here in Switzerland, that we are now proposing this project, so we are looking for partners, and I've seen that the perception of the farmers have changed in the last 3 years, because also 3 years ago there was the idea to organize a meeting to discuss about the use of agroforestry for forage production, and there were just 5 people interested. We represented the same idea, the same concept 2 months ago, and there were more than 60 people interested. So what I'm seeing here is that the impact of climate change and the impact of these summer droughts that are becoming more and more frequent, more and more severe, also in regions in which normally there was enough rain for the grass growth. Now there are a lot of concerns by the farmers, by the cantonal authorities, by the agricultural conseillers. And so I think this concept of agroforestry is becoming more interesting, because farmers are really looking for some practical solution to overcome this reduction of forage production. So they are looking for different solutions, and also this agroecological solution, which is linked to the use of trees, is becoming more and more attractive to them. So I'm been contacted by several of them. I'm meeting them. We are having some focus discussion, and now we are planning this project that will start next year. And so, yeah, the only point I wanted to add is this one, that there are not only technical, agronomical aspect to take into account, not only economical one, but also social one. And I think there is also a big change which is really related to the impact of climate change. So I'm quite confident that also this evolution in agriculture will develop in the next years. And of course, there are also bigger projects about agroforestry that are not only related to grassland, but also to crops, how to put trees into crops. There are many also mitigation measures about climate change. And of course, the trees can play a role also in not only in adaptation, but also in mitigation measure, and to stock carbon in the soil for a long term. And yeah, so maybe it was just this point that I could add into the discussion I didn't mention before. Yeah.
And this is important to do with these social aspects. My question is also about the policy level. Is our political decision makers are also sensitive to the agroforestry aspects in order to include agroforestry measuring to agricultural policies? Or there is some work to do in that sense, in that direction?
Yeah, there are some ongoing discussion on that, but generally they are open and to change also the direct payment in agriculture, and to include some new measurement which are really linked to agroforestry. Because before, of course, there were the classical, let's say, the classical measure which were linked only to the grassland management and something like that. And the trees were seen in a different way. They were seen like encroaching species that can reduce the grassland cover. So generally were less encouraged, above all in the grassland part. But now there are ongoing discussion also at the federal level, and there are a good position I've seen recently. They are starting to think to introduce a new code for these agroforestry hedgerows, for example, so that the farmer can also have some direct support by the agricultural policy to plant this system, because of course this system is also quite expensive for the plantation and also time consuming for the management. So the farmers, of course, need to have also a political and a society help. But I am seeing a changing also in the agricultural policy. Here in Switzerland is every 4 years. The agricultural policy is not like 7 years, I think, is in Europe. So it's more, I think also the process.
It's important to precise that you are not in European Union. So, because you are Switzerland. It would be interesting to see what is going on at the European Union level as well.
Yeah, but I know that there are also some big projects on agroforestry also at the European level. So I think also probably for the next agricultural policy reform, there will be also some changes in that direction. I can imagine, but we will see. Yeah.
Okay. Any other question? We are approaching the end of this webinar. We thank once again our 3 speakers for the effort made. You could appreciate how qualified they are, so don't hesitate to get in touch with them if you have you are in the need to have additional information. Thanks also to the organizers of this electronic conference. Thanks to Anna for her technical assistance. So my understanding is that this webinar will be posted online, so it could be accessed at any time and listening to again. Okay, so I think we can close this session here. I don't know if Anna, you have something to add?
Yeah, no, I'm like a final word, like on behalf of MDPI, thank you all for coming to this session. Thank you, Gianni, to moderate it. Thank you to all the speakers to be here. A final reminder, as Gianni said, we will post the video on the conference webpage during the 2-3 following days. And remember that the conference is still open until the 17th, so you can come to the conference webpage to check on our submissions. That's all. Thank you again to everyone and have a nice day.